Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I just finished a trip to Israel. I've been doing them for a long time now, so I occasionally lead these pilgrimage tours. And I landed at midnight last night, so I don't know what day it is. I just know I'm not in Israel because it's really cold. That's about all I know. Um, and I went at an unusual time. It seems like every time I lead one of these, something happens right before. Something in the news, some announcement, some fight, some issue, and then everybody freaks out. Um, and of course, this was no exception with Trump making his announcement about moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And you might wonder, what the heck is all this about? Which is a good thing to wonder about. It's a good thing to ask when it comes to everything in the Middle East. What the heck is any of this about? And it got me thinking about the either or world that we live in right now. Everything is like binary opposition. Everything is dualistic. And even an announcement like that, immediately people want to know, well, are you for this announcement or are you against this announcement? Those are the only two choices. And you can't say, I don't know. Well, I suppose you could say, I don't know, but then people would look at you kind of strange. That doesn't even seem like an option. And I think everything in our culture reflects this binary opposition, this dualistic mind, which is actually a state of consciousness. Dualism is a state of consciousness, and no one avoids it. You can't get out of it. Just like our lovely little lesson with the orange and the quarter, it's built into our part of our human consciousness to know things in opposition, and even to know oneself in opposition to the other. It's part of our psychic evolution. It's part of growing up. But right now we live in a culture that is almost totally consumed by dualism with no kind of third alternative. No one's saying, hey, let's give oranges to everybody, like in the kids' message. It doesn't even seem like a possibility. That's the way it strikes me. Even our political system, sadly, I was in Israel. There are 32 political parties in Israel, so you can find one to suit your taste. But here we have two, you know? And you can say, yeah, we throw in a little green party, but wait, who are they again? And you can be an independent. But really, we have two choices. And you feel backed into a corner like a caged animal. And especially in this kind of binary opposition. And once you're backed into a corner like a caged animal, you act that way. And you cling and you lunge and fear is activated and all that kind of stuff. Conservative, liberal, pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian. We're basically forced to make a choice. Even when we turn on the television now, the news channels make the choice for us. They offer a certain binary choice for us. I can watch Fox News, and I'm making a choice in doing that, and I'm siding with something, or I can watch whatever, I know CNN's supposed to be in the middle, but let's be honest. And what I'm saying is that this is not healthy consciousness. It's not healthy consciousness. In fact, let's just talk for a moment about consciousness. I'm stealing some things from Ken Wilber, and I'll try to be brief about it, which would be impossible if you're stealing things from Ken Wilber. But let's just talk about four sort of ways of growing up. So you have egocentric consciousness, which everyone goes through. No one gets to bypass any of these things. Okay, there's not like a special space shuttle that you can fly over into higher levels of consciousness. It doesn't work that way. So you have egocentric consciousness, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You're concerned about yourself. Like the theme song would be "I Did It My Way," which of course Trump had played at his inauguration and danced to it. So he might be in that level of consciousness. I don't know. In Wilbur's world, this meme would be red if you're familiar with spiral dynamics. But eventually you grow into ethnocentric consciousness, which children have. Suddenly they say, oh, my family. And ethnocentric consciousness is an evolution. It's an evolution beyond egocentric consciousness. We say, wow, my ethnicity matters. My tribe matters. My family matters. Now, sometimes we'll look down on our nose at this, but I'm telling you, you can't get out of it. You can't get out of it. It's actually a healthy way of coming to know oneself, but you can get stuck in ethnocentric consciousness. And saying something like, oh, I don't know, America first. That's ethnocentric consciousness. And even if you don't even have if I'm not forcing you to make a judgment call on what that means, you can just see it. It's plain as day. It's ethnocentric consciousness. So beyond that, you have world-centric consciousness, which much of the world, especially our young people, are growing up with. They feel less ethnocentric. They still got a fair amount of egocentrism going on, as we all do. But they don't feel quite as drawn to that. But world-centric consciousness makes a little more sense to them. It's an evolution. It's actually in the very DNA of the experiment called America, which is very young when it comes to world experiments. Meaning, can we collect a group of people that don't have any ethnocentric, the fabric of their ethnocentrism has to be woven together. Does it make sense? And beyond that, you have something that might be called ecocentrism. Now, there may be other levels of consciousness. Why am I mentioning these? Because it's just important to remind ourselves consciousness can change and shift. But one of the things that limits any kind of development of consciousness is being locked in this kind of dualism, either or choices. It makes the world very small and tends to keep you stuck in lower levels like egocentrism and ethnocentrism. It does. And actually, it feels kind of safe to be there. And you can do it as a liberal, or you can do it as a conservative. I feel safe in my ethnocentric tribe that thinks like me. Do you see that's the same level of consciousness, no matter what party or political affiliation? So I'm just saying these things out loud. I actually don't really I don't know if I have a main point this morning. I'm pointing these things out. And I'm asking, is it possible for there to be first a personal and then larger shift in consciousness? Is that possible? Like, I've mentioned this before, and I'll probably just keep saying it because it keeps coming up. But you know Einstein's famous quotation, no problem can be solved by the same level of consciousness that created it. No problem can be solved by the same level of consciousness that created it. So if the level of consciousness that created the problem is ethnocentric, guess what? It can't be solved by that same level of consciousness, which is what I'm describing is the American problem right now. And Israel is a good mirror for us. It's a good mirror. It mirrors back to us something. By the way, I started thinking this week about sort of the mythology of Israel and the mythology of America having some parallels. So just go with me just for a brief moment here down this dark trail. I was wondering why there is a lot of motivation to support in our government and in our economic government structure and in our rhetoric to support Israel's narrative. Why is that? Why would we support a country that believes God? I'm giving you the worst of this ideology, just so you know, but that God gave the power and right to a certain people group to come into a land that they were not presently living in and displace the inhabitants of that land. Why would we support that narrative? See? Because that's our narrative. And actually, it's funny. It's like I'm talking about some unconscious things. So to admit that maybe that narrative doesn't work that well over there, it's like we have to admit our own story is messed up. So it's convenient to say, God let them do that, let's support them so that way back down in our unconscious we can support the very same pattern. See what I'm saying? And that, I'm, by the way, making no comment about should there be a state of Israel, or what do we do with these displaced Jewish people who have no place to go. I mean, I have some opinions about that, but I'm just saying the mythology behind it is what's attractive. And it keeps us stuck in dualistic choices like, okay, then you're either pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian. Some of my Christians have a hard time in Israel because they're 1.25% of the population, believe it or not. It's pretty small. And some of my friends who are on the stranger side who live there, who are Christians, they sometimes will say that they're pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, which sounds like they're saying they're nothing at all. But you're starting to get closer to a less dualistic way of dividing the world up. So, I don't know, what else do I want to say? A couple more things. I remember in class one time, in one of my rabbinic Judaism classes, that we were talking about something. This is during the Intifada, the second Intifada, so there were lots of really terrible things going on. And all of a sudden, I remember the professor saying, you have to understand that every single Jewish person here is in some way connected to the Holocaust. It is our collective trauma. Nobody gets out of it. Which struck me. When not only is there personal trauma, but when there's collective trauma, these things run deep. And part of the collective trauma is that nobody will help us. Not even America, not even Donald Trump. There's a wink and a nod that, yes, we'll take your support, but in the end, no one will help us. That's a collective trauma. And guess what? The Palestinians have the same one. So you have two victimized and traumatized people groups living in a land, in a present political situation that they did not make, and then we ask them to get along. And we sometimes force things like big political moves like we're going to move the embassy, thinking we're doing everyone a favor. And guess what happens when you move aggressively toward people who have been traumatized? You don't exactly find open hearts. You find fear, scapegoating, anger, and mostly fear. So yeah, these things are very sensitive. And if no problem can be solved by the same consciousness that created it, what we can say in a very straightforward way is that the Palestinians and the Israelis, the thing that would help the most is a shift in consciousness. Which, if that sounds too fancy to you, a total shift in worldview. If that sounds fancy to you, all of the given options don't work and there must be some other one. That's what I'm talking about. But I don't know how to get there. If I did, I could start an NGO and, I don't know. But I know that it's needed. I know a shift in consciousness is needed, and maybe it's happening in very small and subtle and hidden ways. It's not what you're shown on the news. In fact, you were probably more afraid watching the news here than I was taking people around Israel. I mean, partly because I know it very well and I live there. And I could time it like on a clock. Okay, today, after Friday prayers, there are going to be riots, and I can tell you exactly where those riots are going to be. It's just the way it is. But anyway, what was I saying? Shift in consciousness. How does this really happen? So I started thinking about something Jesus said, and by the way, when I was a pastor at like a mega church, I had to say things about Jesus, and so I would sometimes use Jesus to talk about other things. if I'm just being honest. But now I don't. I can say whatever I want, So it's like, and all of a sudden I'm like, I think I'll say something about Jesus. I just think that's kind of kind of funny. And 'tis the season, after all. Okay, so some people come up to Jesus and they want to know something about. If you want to know some technical things, they're talking to Jesus about something called the oral law. It doesn't say that in the New Testament. That's what they're talking about. These are the teachings of the rabbis. And they say, how come your disciples don't wash their hands before they eat? Okay? It's a ritual thing. It's not in the Torah. This is in basically rabbinic Judaism. So that's a very interesting. Do you hear how dualistic that is right from the beginning? How come they don't wash their hands? So you're given two choices, hand washing or no hand washing. And then you associate stories with hand washing or non-hand washing, like one is good and one is bad, one is righteous, one is unrighteous. So they throw this question at Jesus. And by the way, most of them are like this. If you look at the New Testament, the questions that he gets asked are dualistic like this. So he tells them something. He says, no one takes new wine and puts it into old wineskins. Otherwise, it'll burst and the wine will be ruined. That's his answer. No one takes new wine and puts it into old wineskins, otherwise it's going to ruin everything. He says, if you have new wine, you put it in new wineskins. And then he throws in a little aside, and no one who tastes old wine, or anyone who tastes old wine knows that it's better. What kind of answer is that? Seriously, what kind of answer is that? That is the emergence of non-dual consciousness. That's what that is. That's what the answer is. It's not dualism. Jesus is more interested in shifting people's consciousness than having a conversation about hand washing. Which, to relate back to everything that I've been saying about Israel and Palestine, that's what I'm saying. We should be wondering about a shift in consciousness, not are you for or against the embassy. By the way, I just had this image. I lived in a neighborhood called Abu Tor, only mixed Jewish Arab neighborhood in Jerusalem. And about a few minutes walk from my apartment was the land on which the future embassy is supposed to be, held or whatever. It's supposed to go on this plot of land. There's not that much just available land in Jerusalem, as you can imagine. It's almost like a park with these beautiful trees. I just thought, this place does not need a $1 billion bunker. That's what, if you were to, now we're getting into dualism. But if you were to whisper into the earth and say, what do you need? What does the earth need? I don't think it would say, I need a $1 billion bunker, because that's exactly what it would be. So what do we need? And how does the needed shift in consciousness happen? I really am asking that genuinely. How does a shift in consciousness happen? Especially when our only options are either or. So back to Jesus' teaching. Let's listen to it again. You can't take new wine. Here, I'm going to throw in some interpretations. New situations, new ideas, and new realities. Can't take new wine and cram it into old stories, situations, and narratives. Otherwise, the whole thing is going to be ruined. That is a summary of what's happening on both sides. Did you know, what's that guy's name? Now he's like not on the news all of a sudden. Roy Moore. Okay. What happened to that guy? A pastor said of him, he was falsely accused, just like Jesus. Vote for him. Okay. You know what Yasser Arafat said about Jesus after he watched, what's that Mel Gibson movie? Not The Last Temptation of Christ. That's a good movie. The Passion of Christ. Yeah. Yasser Arafat said Jesus is a good Palestinian oppressed by the Jews. Isn't that funny? To me, that's like, are you serious? Yeah. But you can almost just take. He's like, it's like free Jesus time, and you're going to shove him into whatever narrative works for you. But in the Middle East today, and in politics in general, we have a brand new situation. Nothing like the modern state of Israel has ever existed in the history of the world. That's a new situation. It is unlike any place on earth. It's never existed, including the borders and boundaries, which were invented by the British and the French after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, if you want to know, and then were messed up in 1948 and messed up again in 1967 and messed up in 1971, and on and on and on it goes. What I'm saying is this situation has never existed before. And these two people groups have never lived side by side. Not really. Not really. They haven't. You have Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, meaning I have a friend who's from Yemen. He speaks Arabic and he's Jewish and he lives in Israel. And I have, friends from Poland who live in Israel and they're Jewish. What do these cultures even have in common? Not to mention the so-called Palestinians, which is also a rhetorical term invented by the Romans. Did you know that? The Romans said, now I'm getting this is TMI, too much information. But the Romans tried to kick out the Jews completely from the land of Israel in 135 AD. And they renamed it, it was called Judea, Palestine. The Romans did that. And it was a corruption of the word Philistine. That's what they were trying to say the Jews were never here, the Philistines were here before them, so let's rename it that. And then in the modern era, the basically displaced Jordanians, that's what the West Bank was Jordan at one time, the displaced Jordanians said, let's identify ourselves as Palestinians. Very interesting. Do you know the Palestinians is a made-up people group? If you were to go family by family, you'd find out they come from all over in the Middle East. Very interesting. Okay, new wine. That's my point. New wine. That's never existed. But if you take that and shove it into old narratives, what happens? It just doesn't work. The wine runs out all over the place and it bursts. So what does Jesus say? New wine needs new wineskins. All I'm trying to say is we need new wineskins, but I don't know what they are. I don't know what they are. Nobody does. Nobody does. So I was thinking about how non-dual teachers present situations that distract us from our binary thinking or put us in a situation where either or dualism doesn't work. And we have to sit in that tension long enough for something new to emerge. Because if it's a third way, it means it's never existed before. Sometimes we think a third way, you've heard people talk about a third way, is really just something they already thought of. And they're saying this is the third way. Actually, in this kind of non-dual consciousness I'm talking about, something emerges that surprises everyone. But you have to live in the tension long enough for something like that to happen. And okay. And I'm just wondering out loud now what it would be like, I think on a personal level, to resist a bit of our own personal dualism in the present situations at hand. What would that look like? And that's not to say you can't have an opinion. You can have an opinion, but to quickly cling to a kind of polar opposition only seems to make the divisions deeper, and the possibility of something new, it tends to push it down. Am I making sense? And who else is going to do that? Not the government. I mean, this is how the government's run. I always trust that there are a few people inside there that are moving a little beyond ethnocentrism to maybe world-centric, or no one is near ecocentric at this point. But what would it look like? I mean, what else would the emerging consciousness in the world look like other than people beginning to not be so dominated by dualistic choices all the time? Which means we have to resist it a little bit too. And I guess I'm preaching to myself. I have to resist it because, man, I really, really like making Donald Trump the enemy for all things. I do. It feels so good. But I know it comes from the same dualistic consciousness. It does. So how can I resist? And Israel-Palestine to me is a giant mirror and reminds me I can't do that. And plus, now I have friends on both sides, so I really can't do it. I can't do it. And one more thing. I think two questions, I'll leave you with these two questions that I think are worth asking, that are psychospiritual questions. The first question, when presented with such dualism, is very simple. What is it like to be you? I'm talking about the other. What is it like to be you? I think this is one of the most missing questions in our culture. What is it like to be you? Just put that on the Israel-Palestine situation. What's it like to be you? In other words, I'm interested in your personal story, which is another way of saying I'm interested in the reality right now that exists, the new wine. That needs to be spoken. But we tend to shut down voices we don't really want to hear. That's what we tend to say, tell us your story if we like it. So this forces a kind of humanizing, I think, to say, what is it like to be you? And by the way, I think you can imagine your most intimate and close relationships are rooted in a question like that, correct? What is it like to be you? Think about the whole Me Too movement right now. You know what that is? Very simply, what's it like to be you? And you have the right to say what it's like to be you. So, that's question number one. Question number two is, what story am I making up? I got that from Brene Brown. She's like a psychologist. Research. She's a shame researcher. That always sounds fun. What story am I making up? And here's where you have to begin to do a kind of searching moral inventory of your own worldview and the stories that you are clinging to and adhering to and making up. It's tough work. It's tough work. I'll tell you one story that surprised me. I used to be a part of a church called Narkis. And Narkis is the name of a street, so that was the name of the church. And churches are not well liked in Israel, especially Protestant churches, because they don't have enough time in the land. So I was part of this Protestant church, but it was really like eclectic kind of weirdo sort of place. And in 1982, it was burned to the ground by some ultra-Orthodox Jews. And that week, the synagogue next door brought over their own chairs, and they sat in a circle in the ashes and had a joint service. So the dualistic opening story, you belong here, you don't belong here, you have the right to live here, you don't have the right to live here, our religion versus your religion, that dominates the headlines. The more subtle and interesting story is what happened later on that week. Because I imagine just a couple people burned the church down, but instead, dozens of people chose to sit together in the ashes and have a kind of joint service. If you don't know this, Jews and Christians don't really have joint services, especially over there. Maybe on like the campus of Princeton, but not so much in just some random neighborhood in Jerusalem. And I was there this week, and I went to, at night, there was a Hanukkah Christmas celebration where these two communities came back together again to remember that. It happened in 1982. And they sang some songs, and the Jews sang some Christmas songs, and the Christians sang some Hanukkah songs. It was like weird and awesome. That's the beginning, I think, if I can be very honest, of the emergence of a different kind of consciousness that's less dominated by dualism. So I hope, this holiday season, you can sit with some of these, this invitation. And I think this is an invitation that has the future of humanity at stake. I will get to this in a minute, but just listen to the closing affirmation. Do not like, do not dislike, all will then be clear. Thanks for listening.